Well, hey guys, how you doing today? Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Thanks for being here. I wanted to talk today a little bit about UFOs and aircraft safety. This is an issue I became familiar with while attending the Citizen Hearing on Disclosure 2013 at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., the event that was hosted by the Paradigm Research Group, where there were over 40 witnesses, 5 former representatives, and 1 former senator who were chairing the meeting. It wasn't an official meeting because these weren't active congressmen and senators. They were retired, but it's pretty much as close as you could get. Now, first of all, I have to say, I'm not an expert on this issue of UFOs and aircraft safety, and I'm sure that you might know of cases that I haven't heard of. There are probably hundreds or maybe even thousands of cases that I'm not aware of, and feel free to put them in the comment box below if you know of any important cases that you think are relevant to this video. But I want to talk today about several cases that I'm familiar with, 2 of which came up at the Citizen Hearing. The first case was the one that you may be familiar with. It's Flight 1628, Japanese airliner that originated in Paris. It was going to Tokyo, apparently carrying a full cargo of Beaujolais wine. This was a cargo jet. They were passing over the Anchorage area in Alaska, and Captain Terauchi reported first that 2 large objects approached his 747. They were so close that he could feel the heat coming through the window. Later, the 2 objects moved away, and a larger walnut-shaped object approached his 747 from behind. And Anchorage Air Control was so concerned that they had him move in a circle to try to get away from the object, but it followed him. The walnut-shaped object, if I can remember this correctly, is later joined by the other 2 objects, and they later did maneuvers. First they were stacked vertically, and then they moved horizontally. I don't know, maybe they were trying to communicate or something. He was so concerned about this event that I believe he requested to land, or they asked him to land, and he landed at Anchorage and described what he had seen. When he landed in Tokyo, he was confronted by a large amount of news crews, and Japanese Airlines was so angry with him that they assigned him to a desk job for a while in retribution for having told the truth about what he had seen. Because as you're aware, pilots are discouraged from talking about these sorts of events. You'll remember the O'Hare incident from 2006, where 25 United employees saw a disc-shaped object over their terminal, which then went straight up into the clouds, punched a hole through the clouds, and a lot of people saw it. They were all told not to talk about it. And actually, I don't believe that even the local Chicago news reported about it for a few months. Well, there's this policy. If you know any pilots, or if you are a pilot, you know that you're really not supposed to talk about these things. You could get a psych evaluation or something like that. It's not good for your career. But in any case, this incident was talked about by John Callahan, formerly of the FAA under the Reagan administration. Callahan was the 3rd down at the FAA, and he was very familiar with this Japanese airliner incident because he said that the Reagan science team and a number of the intelligence agencies, I think he said all of the major intelligence agencies were interested in this case because it lasted for about half an hour. And they had a meeting about it and wanted him to turn over the radar tapes. He told us that he gave them the tapes, he gave them the copies, and he kept the originals. Now, John Callahan told us at the Citizen Hearing that as the meeting came to an end, the CIA guy said, "We were never here, this meeting never happened, and you're all sworn to secrecy," and they left the room. I went up to him afterwards and said, John, it's just a fascinating case. What else was there to it? He said, the guys from the CIA came up to me afterwards and said, "We're really interested in this tape because we've never had a UFO on radar for half an hour before. It's usually a few minutes." And if you remember the USS Nimitz 2004 incident from a few weeks ago, that footage is pretty quick, right? I mean, it's there, that it zips off, at least in one of the videos. So this object was on radar for half an hour. And I got more confirmation from this talking to someone who was very involved in UFO investigation. He worked in the oil industry making machine parts technology for the oil industry. He was up in Alaska and happened to run into a guy that had worked at an Air Force base in 1986, who happened to be in a radar control room the night that that incident happened. I believe it's November 17th, 1986. And this guy told the person who told me this that if the 747 was the size of a centimeter long pencil lead, thin as pencil lead, centimeter long, on their radar screen, the larger walnut-shaped object was the size of a quarter. So here we have secondary confirmation that the Air Force knew about this incident too. The FAA tried to describe it as, I think, some meteor shower or something like this, and skeptics said that Captain Terriucci saw Venus. You know the usual typical explanations. Maybe he saw flocks of geese reflected off a weather balloon. I don't know. But look, I know now that there were other witnesses to this event, that the Air Force knew about it, and that's why they held this meeting with John Callahan of the FAA, who told us it was a UFO. It was a real bona fide thing, and it wasn't flocks of geese or ice particles or anything ridiculous like we're used to hearing to explain these events. I'm not saying those don't explain some of the events, but not this case. Remember, Terriucci said he could feel the heat coming through the windows, and I wrote about that in Black Swan Ghosts, this other witness that came forward who had been in the Air Force at the time. Now, there was another witness at the citizen hearing, retired Colonel Oscar Santamaria, who had that incident back in 1980 in Peru where there was military exercises going on at one of their air bases, and 1,800 people were on the ground, saw this object moving around above the airfield. It was seen on radar. Santamaria was asked to go up, being an ace pilot, one of the best pilots they had in Peru, and try to get this thing. He had orders to shoot it. And in his Sukhoi 22, he had a 30 millimeter cannon. He said he released all 64 rounds of his 30 millimeter cannon at this object, which was moving around in front of his plane, later moved around to the tail. He accelerated up to around 65,000 feet, I believe, and the object followed him and so forth. He said at the moment he released his cannon, a number of the rounds, all of them were released. A number of them hit the object and were absorbed by the object. Okay, so this is a case of a pilot firing at a UFO. Now, in the past, we've been told that when the U.S. Air Force did this, or the Russian Air Force, that there were sometimes retaliation from these craft that were being shot at. And again, I'm not an expert in that area, but I've heard many cases of that, even at some point that the U.S. was losing a lot of planes trying to fire at these UFOs, and later the orders were changed here and in the Soviet Union, don't shoot at them anymore because they can retaliate. Merrill Cook, who was one of the former members of Congress that was at the citizen hearing, came into the hearing, he said, as a skeptic, an open-minded skeptic. He didn't believe in the phenomena. But he told us, especially since hearing the testimony of Oscar Santamaria, that he was really convinced by the evidence that this really was an aircraft safety issue. And he said by the end of the conference that he was really convinced that this was more important than ever. After the citizen hearing, I called Merrill Cook on the phone. I was really curious, having met him at lunch and talked with him, what did you think about all the evidence? Because the citizen hearing for me was one of the strongest events related to disclosure that I've ever been involved with. And I was really curious how one of the panelists who had conducted the mock hearing, what they thought about it. So I called him on the phone. I actually found his number online on the internet. I called him. And amazingly enough, he actually picked up, and we had a conversation. I said, wow, it's great that you answered the phone. He said, yeah, I like to talk to my constituents. So I asked him, what did you think of the citizen hearing? And Merrill said, I found it very convincing. I was especially concerned now that I know it's a real phenomena, whatever it may be, wherever these vehicles are from, that it could affect airline safety. Now, you'll remember a long time ago, I can't find it online at the moment, but there was a case of a Lufthansa pilot who was flying his jumbo jet into Mexico City Airport. He said there was a disc, a metallic disc, about the width of his fuselage below him. And just because he's coming in for a landing, he can't really move that much. He actually ended up hitting it. And he remembered hearing the sounds. And when he landed, he looked, and there was a huge gouge underneath the length of the fuselage where he had seen the object where it had hit. And he reported it to Lufthansa. And what do you think their official conclusion was? Metal fatigue. You see, they always find a way to try to explain it away. But he said he visually saw the object. So this is an issue that has affected civilian airliners. But for the most part, it seems to affect military aircraft because they're up in the skies and patrolling areas of the sky that they feel that they need to protect. Now, Merrill Cook, later on in February of 2016, gave a presentation about his impressions of being at the citizen hearing to the UFO Congress, which has an annual meeting near Scottsdale, Arizona. And I've been to it a couple times. It's a lot of fun, and I've met a lot of interesting people, including Dr. Richard Hoover and many others over the years. In his talk to the Congress, Merrill said that after learning of the reality of this phenomena at the citizen hearing, he asked his colleagues who were still serving in office in Congress, why don't you do something about this? How come we don't have congressional hearings about this phenomena, given that it's real and it's actually affecting our aircraft up in the sky? And he said, and this is on video, you can watch this at the Open Minds website. He said that they told him, yes, Merrill, we know this is a real phenomena, but we're getting money from some of the special access programs not to talk about it. It's literally what he said. They told him if we were to talk about it, we wouldn't be reelected. So they knew it was the right thing to do to talk about this issue, but they were afraid to do it because it might hinder their chances of being reelected. I mean, how about that? I mean, it's almost unbelievable, but it is believable. In any case, we know this is a real event. Merrill Cook is one of the most senior people I've talked to who've come forward to say this is a real event, and my colleagues are afraid to talk about it. Now, there's two other incidents that I'm aware of, which I find very interesting, which I wrote about in Black Swan Ghosts. Now, to get these stories, it took a while because these witnesses, for a variety of reasons, didn't want these stories to go public, but I was able to change their names and basically convince them that it was in your interest to know about these events. The reason I feel so good about putting this book together was because a lot of these witnesses told me their stories like over a beer or something, and then later told me never to repeat it again. And I didn't really think that was fair to you because I think you deserve to know the truth like we all do. So it took me a while to make them feel okay with putting these stories in the book. And this next one comes from a pilot I know who I'll call Jack. And he told me this really fascinating story, really good one, that I had never heard before. I bet you've never heard of it either. He said that there was a co-pilot he was flying with one day in a long intercontinental flight. And it was kind of, nothing was really going on. This co-pilot started talking to him and said that he used to be in the Air Force, and while they were flying B-52s over Turkey during the 1967 conflict between Israel and the Arab states, the United States wanted to send a message to the Soviet Union not to invade Israel during this conflict. What the Air Force did was to send convoys of nuclear armed B-52s in convoys of 3, spaced a mile apart along the Soviet-Turkish border, right? And they were just inside the Turkish border. By the way, this was called Operation Chrome Dome. The Air Force would do this a lot in different border areas of the Soviet Union. But this is just one example during the 1967 Arab-Israeli conflict. And as they were doing, by the way, these flights were refueled in the air. So once they took off from the United States, they didn't land until they came back in the United States. As they were flying along the Soviet-Turkish border, this co-pilot said to my friend Jack that 3 objects came down from about 45 degrees to the right. And, you know, they're cruising up at pretty high altitude, so these objects are coming from even higher up. Circle around the front of the first plane, which this co-pilot happened to be in at the time, went down the left side all the way to the rearmost B-52, came up along the right side. And as they did this, the guy that was in charge of electronics and communication in the plane said, "Sir, we're being jammed on all frequencies," or scanned on all frequencies. Basically, their radios became useless for a few minutes as these objects were in the vicinity of their convoy. And then it came by in the front again of the lead plane. Now, this guy actually happened to have a camera in the cockpit. It was a Nikon camera that was a gift from his wife from the previous Christmas. So he was really fond of this camera. And he was able to take a couple pictures of these objects, which were kind of in what Jack described as a fingertip formation, kind of like a V. And they kept this formation the whole time. They then took off the way they had come from a 45-degree angle back up into space. Now, when these B-52s landed sometime later in the United States, the co-pilot had radioed in the sighting of these objects. When they landed on the airstrip, there were a couple guys in suits, maybe dark glasses, and they said, "We'd like your camera. We'll return the camera later." Okay. Well, this guy never got back his film, nor did he get back his camera, which is why he was particularly incensed, because it had been a gift from his wife the previous Christmas. And furthermore, these guys told him, "You are never to talk about this again." Okay. So just another example of how these incidents can happen, and we wouldn't have heard about it, even though, they're very important from, just our own history of our own country, our own military's history, and so forth. So this next story involving aircraft and UFOs has to do with someone that I'll call John. I had known John for about 15 years before he told me this story. And he had alluded to it, and then all of a sudden he mentioned it, and I said, "Well, I'd like to know more about this." This is way before I was going to write any book about this subject. And it took him about a year before one day I received a whole stack of handwritten notes about this particular incident involving planes and UFOs over Lake Superior in 1964. Now, when he wrote these notes, he didn't expect me to keep them. He actually said at the end of the letter to burn these notes because he believed this might have violated some national security law for him even to share this information with you. But I didn't burn them because I thought this was simply too important to American history and to your knowledge of what's really going on. And I was able to get his permission to put it in Black Swan Ghosts and to share it with you now. So here's the story. John told me that his dad, and this is someone I know very well, so I don't doubt a single word of what he says here, that his dad served in the Air Force at a place called Finland Air Force Base in the 1960s in Minnesota. John told me that when he was a kid, he was only about 12 at the time, his dad and his Air Force buddies used to hang out downstairs in the kitchen. And because of the way the air vents were in the house, John could hear everything that they were talking about, even while he was lying in bed. Now, John said that his father and his buddies would never refer to these objects as UFOs. They referred to them as OWCs. And John never knew what that meant until he said that he read one of Jim Marr's books and he found out that it referred to off-world craft. They didn't know he was listening, but he couldn't help it because the air vents come from the kitchen, went right up through his room, and he could hear what they were saying. He said one night they were talking about an incident, this was in 1972, where a UFO was coming in from Canada, and they were notified by Canadian Central Air Command that this UFO was going about 1,000 miles per hour and was going to cross over into U.S. airspace. The Air Force Base attempted to communicate with the object, but it didn't respond. So they launched two F-104 Starfighters, which attempted to intercept and communicate with the object. Now, the pilots never saw the craft, but they saw it on their radar. And John's father had some position at the base where he was authorized to instruct these pilots to launch their missiles, which he did when the craft refused to respond. And the pilots radioed back after launching their missiles that the missiles had failed to reach their target and their engines had both flamed out in both F-104s at the same time. that they were going down into Lake Superior, and they disappeared from Finland Air Base's radar. Later on, according to what John told me, and he'd heard his dad saying, is that they had found the planes at the bottom of Lake Superior, but they hadn't found the pilots. The pilots had simply disappeared. The canopies hadn't been opened. The ejection seats hadn't been used. The pilots were nowhere to be found. Now, it turns out that there's another witness to this story, because John ran into someone who happened to serve at Finland Air Base at the radar that night. He just happened to meet this guy in the same industry that he works in. And this guy, Bob, said he was stationed at Finland Air Base radar control, and that they observed this incident, and that the UFO initially was going 1,000 miles per hour, but all of a sudden the jets disappeared from the radar, and then the object went from 1,000 miles an hour to somewhere between 6,000 to 8,000 miles an hour, and in 2 sweeps of their radar, the object was gone. He said that the G-forces that any occupants would have absorbed inside an object like that would have, crushed any human. So this was definitely some technology that the U.S. Air Force didn't have. That's what he was convinced of at the time. And this was further reinforced when the next day, this guy Bob said that government agents came to the base, made people sign non-disclosure agreements, and told them that anyone who talked about this would go to jail. So again, more intimidation. Pilots, people involved in airlines, military, aircraft, again, more intimidation and suppression of what the actual truth is about it. Now, there's another incident from Black Swan Ghost. This happens to do with remote viewer Lyn Buchanan, who served in Project Stargate in the Defense Intelligence Agency. Maybe some of you have heard of Lyn Buchanan. He was author of this excellent book, The Seventh Sense, all about remote viewing and the history of the military remote viewing project and so forth. It's a really great book on the subject, and I highly recommend it. Now, Lyn told this story a couple times during his classes that I attended, also at some conferences where he presented. And he said that he had always had this memory, which he wasn't sure if it was a dream or an actual experience, of being taken up in a ship behind his house one day as he was moving, and the house was sort of empty and he was the only one there, and this object had landed behind the house and he'd been taken aboard, and at some point he actually was allowed to fly the object because he had large hands. He could control this kind of control panel which had lights on it, and you tried to kind of keep the lights together, and that's how the object remained stable. But he was never sure if this was an actual experience or a dream. And what he told me was that he gave it as a target to the remote viewing unit at Fort Meade just to see what they would come up with the instructions that no one should talk about it. This would be some sort of private RV project that they were going to work on. And somehow somebody did talk about it, because a couple days later, after doing this viewing, which people did get was sort of a UFO, and they said that his experience was real, some government scientists visited him and were interested in that control panel, which you're able to control with your hands and can keep the lights together to keep the UFO stable. And when he described how the control panel worked, one of them slapped his leg and said, "So that's how they do it," which was more confirmation to him that this was a real event. Then around 1989, an old Army buddy of his had approached him and said, "Hey, do you want to see where I worked?" It was a hangar where there was a lot of wreckage from mid-air collisions that were being studied by experts. And Lyn got to go into this hangar, and he saw wreckage where in the midst of this wreckage, there was a plane that was in pieces and some other wreckage of some object it had collided with. And in the middle of the wreckage, Lyn could see the control panel. And he said, without thinking out loud, "Hey, that's out of a UFO." And said he was forcibly escorted out of the facility at that point. So he had actually seen, allegedly, the wreckage of a collision between a plane and a UFO. And if you want to learn more about this event, you can read Jim Marr's book, Alien Agenda, where Jim wrote about this incident too. So I hope you found this interesting. This is a much bigger issue than we've been told. As you can see, the pilots have experienced it. If they talk about it, they get punished, just like Captain Tarucci was. If they're in the military, they have to sign non-disclosure agreements for national security reasons, whatever the national security reason is, even years later, that they shouldn't be talking about it. They're not talking about it. And then your representatives in Congress, who also know about this, are being paid not to talk about it. So is it no wonder that we are confused about this issue? We don't really know what's going on. We've been living in a UFO information vacuum while these incidents have been happening around us. There's also that famous incident from Iran in 1976, where the pilots of these F-4s attempted to intercept a UFO, and their missile systems and everything locked up as soon as they got close to it. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. This is an important issue. I'm sure we're going to be learning a lot more about this. I just thought you'd find that interesting. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you soon. Take care for now, and bye.